Greetings, friends and educators. Welcome to another episode of the Informed Educator Research and Teaching in the Anthropocene. We're your hosts, Lauren and Anne. Today, we welcome Dr. Katrina Keefer. Katrina Keefer is a digital humanities scholar, game developer, and historian whose work bridges cultural history and interactive media. She specializes in identity, body marking, slavery, and initiatory societies in West Africa, with much of her research focused on Sierra Leone and the Atlantic world. At Trent University, she develops innovative digital tools, including games and web-based platforms, to trace identities through archival records and democratize knowledge about the past. She is the author of Children, Education, and Empire in Early Sierra Leone and Cannibalism, Myths, Empire, and Identity in Colonial Sierra Leone. Today, we'll be focusing on her work with games and gamified learning and how they can be used effectively in education. Welcome, Dr. Keefer.
Thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
So to get us started, for those of us who are unfamiliar, can you tell us a little bit about gamification?
So gamification it's a kind of a catch-all, and we see it used in a whole lot of fields. So it becomes something that's very vague, and it becomes what people want it to become, I find, in different contexts. But at its simplest, it's really engaging the human capacity to play. It's engaging the fact that we learn best when we're playing. And so if you remove formalized structures that people are kind of defensively wired to go, oh no, there's a test coming. Oh no, I'm going to be assessed on this thing or evaluated. And you turn it into, hey, if you do the thing, you're going to get some gemstones. And you can use those gemstones to buy a cooler thing. And next thing you know, you've now made it into a playful game. You've now encouraged people to think about whatever that structured approach is, whatever that task is, not so much in terms of a negative kind of a top-down, how do we assess you, how do we look at you, how do we judge you, but more, how do we reward you for this thing that you how do we make it fun for you to want to do this? And so it doesn't necessarily have to be fun per se, but it has to engage in that human capacity for play. And so it's a really different strategy for learning. It's a different way to encourage people. And it's a very fine balance because there's intrinsic desire and there's extrinsic desires in terms of why we play and what we are playing for and how we can approach that in terms of pedagogic strategies or just life in general. So, we can formalize the structures of things so that your rewards are equivalent to achievements. So for those who play video games, there's usually a lot of achievements, which are basically an extrinsic reward. You did the thing, you looked at all the things in a given space, congratulations, you've unlocked an achievement. Now, achievements are fascinating, and when I teach game studies, I always end up having conversations with students about this, because there's some people who are driven within a game space. And I'll speak about game spaces in a sec, because I think we can also argue that the classroom is a game space, based on the theory of the magic circle. I'll get into that in a moment. Trying to stay structured in my brain. It's always fun on a Monday morning. So when you're looking at the idea of extrinsic versus intrinsic, and what motivates people to play, this becomes really interesting, because for some people within a game space, let's imagine a hypothetical landscape. So you have a beautiful, verdant, rolling landscape. How lovely. And you might invite people to wander around the landscape and find stuff. So this could be useful in a real-world context if you want to teach people geolocation, if you want to teach people how to do cool geography stuff or find stuff or learn navigation tricks and trades, all that good stuff. Now, there's a lot of ways you could do that. You can instruct people, go find the third tree on the left and then turn right at the boulder, whatever. And those are just instructions. That's sort of a top-down, do the thing. It's not very playful. But if you say, well, there's items hidden around this landscape, see if you can find them all. If you find them all, there's a reward. And you can do that digitally and you can do that in person. There's a whole lot of different ways you can do that. And people are going to have different reasons for why they want to do this. And that's where the intrinsic versus extrinsic comes in. An extrinsically motivated person will explore that landscape because they know they'll be rewarded for finding all the things. Whether it's a badge, whether it's a candy bar, whether it's a little achievement on their Steam account saying, you found all the things. But other people are driven because they just find a real joy in finding the things. And they don't really give a damn about the candy bar. What they care about is, I found all the things. Oh my God, I learned the secrets. And so that's that intrinsic thing. And so you have to really pitch your gamification based on an understanding of your audience. And that can be really, really intriguing in terms of how that all plays.
That's so interesting. Do you, as an instructor, privilege extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation? Are you trying to get your students to a place where they are intrinsically motivated to do this learning? Or do you sort of honor both as separate, but perhaps equally motivating? I know in public school teaching, we talk about extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation, and we do tend to privilege, like we're trying to get students to want to learn for the joy of learning. But maybe this is just part of the diversity of learners, that for some people the joy comes in getting the jewel, and there's nothing wrong with that. um, what do you think what do you think?
I lean towards I think different people do things for different reasons. I think we have to be very conscious of our own biases. Like, I personally am an intrinsic learner. So, give me a library and I don't need a STEAM achievement. I don't need a candy bar. The joy of just reading everything or learning a thing to the utmost degree, that's my drive. However, my son, who's 11 now, he's not particularly intrinsic. And I have tried every technique under the sun to sort of, isn't it fun to do this? Or isn't it great? Yeah, no, he's into it for the candy bars. And so I think I've had to reevaluate my own approach to this and realize that there are learners for whom they really just need that push. And maybe they will develop a joy from inside, but it may be very context specific. And that may speak to whatever their drives and passions are. So both my son and I do sword fighting. We do fencing. And that's something he's been doing since he was 5. I've been doing for the last 8 years. And it is a joyful and wonderful thing. And it's very interesting why we each do it and how we each do it. Because that's been a non-academic space. So it's a sport space that I'm looking at. And so it's a very unfamiliar space for me to be exploring and looking at, but it has a lot of parallels. So I find it a really interesting kind of a microcosm in a lot of ways. And so when I approach fencing, I recognized that here was this thing I'd wanted to do since I was a child. Hitting people with swords. Like, really, does it get better? I mean, I think every child given a stick has an immediate thought. And that thought is to whack someone with it. And it's part of our job sometimes as human society to try and slow down the whacking process. So for me, this was as an intrinsic learner, like, okay, I know I'm going to look terrible for years. I'm not going to look cool, but I want to learn this so badly that I'm going to learn every single slow step along the way. And if I don't look cool in the process, that's fine, because at some point it's all going to come together. And so that's me as a mature learner, and that's me as an intrinsic learner. Now, my son started at 5, so we're dealing with someone who maybe hasn't got that drive just yet. And the coaching club that we were at, they used gamification. And I thought that was absolutely brilliant in a sport context because it was tying in. And I think this is really important for educators, for learners, for parents, just everybody in our community and in our society at present. Our kids today get exposed to a ton of extrinsic motivators. And they're getting that all the time. If they're playing video games, if we're letting them play video games, if they're on TikTok, if there's anything like that, there's external validation, which is flowing at them all the time. And so it's really hard for them to necessarily really go intrinsic when everything comes with a reward cookie. So how do you then motivate a kid to want to do something that's physically challenging, that's difficult, that requires discipline? And you can either do that by just telling them, well, you're going to do it. And I mean, that's certainly one approach. And recognizing it's good for their physical literacy, it's good for their ability to move their bodies, it's good for them to develop that personal discipline. There's a whole lot of ways. What I found really fascinating was that the coaches had decided after years of dealing with kids that they created a reward system where that's speaking to the gemstone thing. They went and got inexpensive little fake gem things from Michael's. and the kids get pay bags. And at the end of every lesson, the kids have to line up. And if they've been on task, if they've been present and accounted for, if they've been good listeners, they each get 3 of these little gems, 1 for each task or 1 for each kind of category of motivator. And at the end of it, they can use those gems to purchase better swords or better shields. And then the kids learn to whack each other with these foam swords and foam shields. And I thought, well, this is really clever because for an intrinsic learner, they're there because they want to play with swords. But so many kids are extrinsic at that age, and they're being guided to be extrinsic at that age, that giving them a series of rewards is a really valuable way to really pump that. So I think it's a balance. So that was a long way of coming back to the intrinsic versus extrinsic. I think partially it's age dependent, it's situationally contextual, and I do think we probably see more extrinsic learners today than we may have in a pre-internet time period.
That is so insightful, Katrina. Thank you so much. I think that response will be of interest to anyone who teaches children or adults.
It's also interesting, right? Like, and it's not a question I have, it's just an observation that our entire system, our educational system is based on an extrinsic motivator, right? Like grades. At the end of the day, regardless of the approach you take in the classroom, the students are getting grades and they know they're getting grades. And oftentimes the value on extrinsic motivators is reflected at home when parents are asking, what did you get, on your test? And so kind of another point on my list against reasons why we should be moving away from a grade.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you because I think it is really interesting that even in this conversation, I think we all have this bias towards feeling that intrinsic learning is somehow more authentic, it's more valuable, it's what you want people to develop because then they are learning for the joy of learning. And like this is all really good stuff. But as you say, our whole system revolves around extrinsic reward systems, doesn't it? And so how are we setting people up for failure at that point where we're saying you should love learning because learning's awesome, but also we're assessing you and here are your grades, and if you've been good, have a gold star, and if you've been bad, oh, you're so bad. And it's like we're really still we're pushing a system that we ourselves don't really think is the right one.
And we're not holding space for students to actually enjoy the process of learning or engage with that, right? Like oftentimes units of learning are prescribed by the educator. They're developed by the educator and they could be based on various things, right? The educator might have various motivations for choosing that unit of learning. The curriculum is very open-ended. You could really go in many different directions with it. But if the student isn't successful based on the standards that the teacher is laying out, then we're really limiting them from having opportunities to discover that joy for learning and those intrinsic motivators, which would be the joy. That's something that I think I came to much later in life, right? Because I was always so focused on pleasing my teacher and the adults in my life that I didn't actually take time to think about whether I was truly enjoying that for myself. So this is great. Cool.
Yeah, I love how we've gotten into this like theories of motivation immediately. But before even like talking about some of the nitty gritty of game-based learning, which is fun. So let's talk about that a little bit. Dr. Katrina Keefer, can you give us perhaps an example or two of a time in your own teaching where you've used game-based methods to help your students learn?
Sure. So part of that, I'll push back slightly because I think motivation is key about this. So there's a few ways that I approach how I do game-based learning. And again, part of it is that motivation. So I believe really strongly in the importance of curiosity-driven learning. And I think that's one of the ways to thread the needle. And that's where games perfectly step in. So it's tricky to deal with games when you are dealing with contentious topics. And that's something we have to be very, very aware of. So my PhD is actually in African history, and in the intro, speaking a little bit about that, my research has largely revolved around the transatlantic slave trade. And obviously there is a very, very robust conversation and discourse around what is appropriate to use for game-based learning what is inappropriate to use for game-based learning. And I think that's really, really key to just sort of flag that and note that. So I confine my game-based strategies very much to game studies, digital humanities, and of course, game design, where it's explicitly part of what we do. So game-based learning, the way that I typically do it, I don't use the extrinsic motivators because if I'm teaching students who are taking game studies anyway, they know exactly what I'm doing. So more often than not, what I do is I come up with playful techniques and I try to maintain play in the classroom. I invite students to develop games in the classroom that pertain to their learning outcomes and what their goals may be. Even if it's not the game design class, we look at how do we create games? How do we make something playful? How can we explore thought experiments, which engage with the idea of play? So I don't use game-based learning in the sense of me following a deliberate strategy to encourage curiosity-driven learning through gamification, ironically, because the classes that I teach have to do with explicitly designing or engaging with games. And the other classes I teach, I am incredibly cautious around. There's some things you really don't want to mess around with, or to look at in any way that could be framed or fashioned as disrespectful, because there's so much trauma associated with it. That said, I can speak to the game that I am developing, if that could be a fun one. So I'm gonna climb on a few soapboxes here because it's stuff I believe really, really passionately in. So just do the digital equivalent of spraying me with a water bottle if I get too crazy. Many of my friends have this permission pretty much granted all the time because I will hold forth at the slightest drop of a hat. So as mentioned, I work in Sierra Leone. And there's a few thoughts that have often come to my mind, and this is where the gamification of history really is where I'm trying to approach things. So first and foremost, when we look at the global south, when we look at historically marginalized communities and people who have been silenced over the centuries, it's really interesting that we don't talk that much about them in game spaces. And most educators who are educating in history, we will have students come to us whose interest and love of history has been sparked because they've played Assassin's Creed, or they've played Crusader Kings, or Europa Universalis, or Civilization, or any one of a number of these types of games. But what are these games teaching us? They're Eurocentric. They're developed by studios in Europe or in North America. Sometimes there's some consultation with marginalized communities or with the people who the story is sort of about. But for the most part, the main developer is a studio that is not driven by the voices who should be being heard. So that was my first kind of, this is problematic. Because too often voices get heard that shouldn't be. And so I recognize and acknowledge I'm a white settler Canadian woman. Sierra Leone is not my story. However, I have the skill set to help people to tell their story. And so that becomes a really key part of the story or of the work. Community collaboration and co-authorship are really, really key to doing this and to approach it with a really anti-colonial bent. So the interpretation and the general idea of the game is and I'll briefly sketch this out for those who don't wander around with a map of Africa and their head floating at all times. I mean, I think everyone should have that, but that's a neat thing. So Sierra Leone is situated on the west coast of Africa. If you imagine Africa in your head, it's kind of at the bumpy bit on the furthest west part. It's not a very big country. It's a spectacular country. If anyone's planning their vacation who happens to be listening, it's amazing. It was settled in 1792 by Black Nova Scotians, Black Loyalists. So there's actually a really interesting Canadian connection there. And it's very well known and acknowledged in Sierra Leone. And they knelt under the cotton tree, which was this gigantic, huge tree, well worth looking up and Googling. Unfortunately, it fell down actually on the same day Tina Turner died, which was after one of those things, man. I have a tattoo of it. So this is a memorial tattoo now. Anyway, so they knelt under the cotton tree, and they're the reason that we have Freetown, which is not named inconsequentially, because it became a place of liberation where the British Vice Admiralty Court and the Royal West Africa Squadron would intercept slave ships and offload the humans on board into Freetown, where they created this very, very diverse and rich culture. Just upriver from Freetown is a very small island called Bunce Island. It's less than a kilometer long, and there was a slave fortress on Bunce Island, and very complicated relationships between the people in the estuary, and really interesting stories. And so I decided to focus my game on Bunce Island, because there are a lot of people whose ancestors passed through Bunce Island. And if you've seen the CBC miniseries, The Book of Negroes, which was based on the book by Lawrence Hill, the main character actually passes through and is sold through Bunce Island. So a little bit of contextual stuff. So the general idea with the game was I had a series of layered intentions. And the game is at the demo stage, but it's very slow in the development because you have to go to villages and make sure people are on board with what you're doing. The idea with the game was to allow people to tell their own version of the history and to enrich that through archival research and make sure that the stories that were being told were really deeply rooted in the history, but were also fun. And fun with air quotes around it, because the idea of fun as a drive towards play and towards curiosity-driven learning, and specifically for use in classrooms. So that's the goal for the game. So the game starts in the demo. What we did was we fully digitized this 1 kilometer long island as it is today. I took teams of students. We used photogrammetry. I'm happy to email you guys if there's useful pictures, because there's a lot of really pretty screenshots from this. And so we used photogrammetry, we used reality capture, we developed in Unreal Engine, and it is as close to a one-to-one so that you are having the same experience when you're navigating around the island that you might if you actually went to the island today. So we recorded the audio from the island. So it's not just plugging in general jungle sound .wave. Like it's literally, we recorded here so that you can hear all the things that you would hear at Bunce. We digitized the trees, because one of the interesting things about the trees at Bunce is that visitors are encouraged to carve their names into the trees. Unlike a lot of archaeological and cultural heritage sites, that's something that the people really believe strongly, that if their ancestors were taken away and their voices were silenced, this is a way to reclaim that space. So digitizing the trees became, as we realized, very, very important. So we did that. And so the idea is that when you enter the space, there are a number of interactable items, and those lead toward achievements, extrinsic motivators. So if you wander around and you click on the cannons, there's a bunch of cannons, 8 in fact, that are sitting there. You can study them from different angles. You decide what profession you want to approach the island from. So you may be an archaeologist, you may be an environmentalist. And what you choose defines what data you get and what information you learn. So if you're an environmentalist and you decide you want to go off the beaten path towards the parts of the jungle, it's full of spider webs, because, not going to lie, Bunce Island jungle is pretty full of spider webs. And like, having walked through those jungle paths a number of times myself, I don't like spiders very much. I would honestly not want to step off the path. But, so if you're not playing as an environmentalist, your character actually shudders and sort of says, no, I'm staying on the path, thanks. But if you're an environmentalist, you actually will learn about the types of spiders that you can find on Bunce Island. What is endemic to that part of West Africa? What are they dangerous? They're really spiky. And they're really interesting. They're really understudied. And so that was an interesting thing to discover as well. So it's basically the idea is to learn and to explore just as you might in real life. Now so the demo pushes you toward that, has the achievements for if you click on all the cannons, then you unlock a cannon trophy in your reading room. That kind of thing. The full game involves meeting a woman from the Temne people, and I thought it was really important that the first language you hear is in Temne, with subtitles. It's not English. And she will direct you to retrieve Mafoi, which is medicine, from the only African grave on the island. And if you retrieve that medicine, she will use Temne divination practice, and she will send your spirit back to the 1720s, at which point it is a bustling slave fort. And one of the other things, the sound is really important. So here's an interesting thought, and this became one of the things that became part of learning. And in a sense, my whole team of students got a chance to fall down curiosity-driven learning, so intrinsic funsies at this point, because asking these questions and falling down rabbit holes is a great way to learn. So you can actually use the process of developing a game as a learning tool, which is really interesting because then you want to learn more stuff. So for example, what language do you think the people used on the island in the 1720s? And I'm asking both of you because I'm curious.
What language do we think the people used on the island in the 1720s?
Yes, they're British slave traders.
Geez, I might have to look into that. I want to say French, but I think that's incorrect, and I don't really base that on anything.
Well, okay. I've taught Canadian history a couple times, and I'm slightly familiar with that time period. Did you say the early 1700s?
1720s. So this is before the Nova Scotians got there.
Okay.
You're dealing with British folks.
Yeah, this is before the 7 Years' War. So, yeah, I can't say. That's a lot earlier than I'm thinking.
Well, I'm just going to assume it was the indigenous language of the place and or English. But I feel like there's going to be a curveball and it's something else.
Okay, I love that you guys are thinking this way because and this is what I mean with how we can use the development of a game to start asking questions and getting curious and going, wait, well, what? And so this is the same process I went through. And again, I love that you guys are thinking this way because this is exactly half the fun of it. And the answer is indeed a curveball. And it kind of blew my mind and it's really funny, by the way. The end result is really funny because I want you to really get into the headspace and like, what would this sound like? So they spoke Portuguese, but it wasn't quite Portuguese because the Portuguese had shown up there in the 1500s. And the Portuguese had spoken to the local people because you have to communicate in order to trade. And so they developed a Creole. And so then the Portuguese left. And so the British, when they arrived, had to learn this creolized Portuguese-ish thing that was not exactly Portuguese and was certainly not the local languages, but had become the trade language. So I want you to imagine a bunch of guys, dudes from Liverpool, dudes from Glasgow, with all the heavy accent that entails, mangling their way through something vaguely resembling Cabo Verdean Portuguese.
And are characters in your game doing this?
Uh-huh.
That's crazy.
Right? But what a fun thought, because one of the things I wanted to challenge through historical research and this kind of playful exploration, asking questions and seeking answers, is we have these ideas when we think about the transatlantic slave trade. We think about the slave traders as this monolithic, powerful, scary bunch of people. And the reality is they were a shambles. They were dying of malaria left, right, and center. So you've got these pretty appalling people who, but they're humans. And I think that's a really important part of pulling the teeth of historical injustice is to recognize the fundamental humanity and the crappiness of these people of the past who perpetuated such violence and such inequity, rather than seeing them as these kind of all-powerful, monolithic, they all speak perfect British English, they're mangling their way through really strange-sounding language. They're not a unified force at all, you know?
Yeah, and this is sort of bringing us to our next little inquiry, which is how games, either developing games or playing games, can help students engage with history or other subjects as well in ways that traditional top-down teaching formats can't. And it sounds like perhaps one of the ways that they benefit these learners is to humanize those that they're learning about. But in other subject areas, they're likely are other benefits as well. I know we've touched on some of them, but would you like to highlight any additional ways that games can help students engage with subjects that those ways might just not be available to more traditional teaching formats?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few really key points that I get really excited about, obviously, because I've just taken us through one fun one. And that's the first one is the rabbit hole. I think rabbit holes are amazing because we are a curious species. And if you ask someone a complicated question that they don't have the answer for, they're often really driven to want to know what the answer is. And if you give students the resources to explore those and to do that learning, one of the things that they will come to, and it is that humanization, is that history's ridiculous. History makes no sense. It's lovely for that. So one of the things my students discovered was, and you discover the challenges, how little we actually know, how we think we know a lot, and we really, really don't. So great example, and I'm using the Bunce project as a sort of a means of exploring this, because this goes into so many fields, and it's the interdisciplinarity and it's the rabbit holes. First one, if we're going to create the Sierra Leone estuary, naturally we want to have villages from the local peoples. This makes perfect sense. Great. Okay. How are you going to do that? That's a problem. Now you've invited the students to solve this problem. And so part of it is through the process of game development, there's one way to do this. And then I'll speak for a moment about the playing of games, because there's the two sides of this process. If you're developing, it's incredibly enriching. And I think there is a tremendous learning potential for just the process of developing a game. Even if you never get to the end product, the process is such a delightful thing because you're learning so much. So, okay, let's say we want to put a bunch of villages in. Well, where are they? That's a problem. So now you're looking, now students are going to go look at historically contemporary maps. And what they're going to discover is that the maps made by European slave traders, because they were the primary people who were exploring that region, are terrible. They don't tell you where villages are. And if they do, the map of the coastline is so far removed from whatever the heck the coastline is today that good luck, those villages are useless. So what's your next solution? And that's where you're leading people into, well, how do we figure this out? So maybe we need to talk to local communities in the region. Do they remember where the villages used to be? Because the villages are not necessarily where they are today. And that's another question. So you can now look into archaeology. You can look into oral tradition. You can look into storytelling. You can look into respectful community co-authorship. And you can start to do this for every single piece of the puzzle. What are the trees like? So we know that there's mangrove forests there. What did a healthy mangrove look like prior to pollution in the Industrial Revolution? That's an interesting question for people in the science side of things. What should a biodiverse ecosystem look like in 1720 prior to the Industrial Revolution? Now you'd better figure out what are the species that you're going to find. What's the salinity going to look like? What color is the water? And so every one of these rabbit holes leads people into a series of curiosity-driven learning experiences where they are themselves intrinsically driven to try and figure out the thing. So rabbit holes, I think, are enormously important. At the same time, there's the historical imagination. And so I bring up rabbit holes because it's not just applying to history, even if it's a historically driven project. So having a bunch of mangrove nerds who do environmental studies, wow, love it. Yes, please. Because I'm a historian. I don't know what a healthy mangrove should look like. So that's part of where the interdisciplinarity of having a rich and robust team with lots of different perspectives is very, very important. And that also helps students because they're all sharing ideas from different fields and they're improving their research methodologies, they're improving their approaches to things. So, okay, we've got that side of it, which is awesome. Let's move to the playful side of it when you're playing the game. And that's also really, really cool. Because what that's doing is it's putting you in the heat of the action. It's putting you in the moment. So I could describe to you what it is like to stand in a hallway and exactly what the dimensions of the hallway are. If we're playing D&D, we certainly might do that. What does that room look like? What does that dungeon look like? That is vastly different than actually being in a 3D environment where oh my gosh, that's a really shadowy corner. I didn't realize that the torchlight doesn't fill that corner. Monsters might be in that corner, right? And so putting yourself in the space becomes a really powerful tool to understand that the people of the past did not have 20/20 vision, in the sense of they did not know everything that was going around them. They were just as flawed, fallible, and weird as we are. And so the decisions that we see made throughout history may actually be driven by being human in that space. And so when you can place people in that space, they can start to understand why certain things happened. The people were not all knowing. They were trying to figure stuff out just as much as we are. They may have been wrestling with a bad case of dysentery at the time and making very poor choices as a result. One of my favorite anecdotes and this speaks to, this is one of my favorite things that I can't wait to release to the public. Because I can't wait to see people's response when they play it. So we know that Bunce Island was run by a fellow who, wow, how am I blanking on his name? Totally blanking on his name right now. It'll come to me. Anyway, so he was a slave trading factor. He was not a nice man. He was a very rough man. Anyway, he was holding the fort, and the famous Black Bart, Bartholomew Roberts, sailed out of Sierra Leone. And Bartholomew Roberts was friends with a pirate who lived in what is today Freetown. And I'm not kidding you, the archival documents are really funny, because that pirate's name was Captain Crackers, who lived, right? AKA John Ledstone. But Captain Crackers ran this pirate settlement in White Man's Bay. Shocking, I know. My students always get a giggle out of this. And Black Bart decided that he was going to go after Bunce, and he was going to take it. And he did, with 3 ships in, I believe, 1704. And there's this great moment, and it's 2 lines in a contemporary archival source. There are 2 lines about this, which I find really interesting. That when Black Bart came to the island, it took his 3 ships a bit of time. The people on the island ran out of cannon, and all of the slave traders fled, leaving only the Robert Plunkett, that's his name, Plunkett. Anyway, so Plunkett was the chief factor, and he ran out of cannon shot to use, so he started using iron bars and stuffing them into the cannons to try and shoot the pirates. He failed. And then he finally fled, and the pirates grabbed him, at which point, according to the source, old Plunkett fell to cursing and damning as faster than the pirates. And so he was dragged in front of Black Bart, who was going to kill him, but the pirates wouldn't let him, because this man had sworn such wonderfully creative insults that they laughed their butts off and they let him free. And so the archive says old Plunkett, by dint of cursing and damning, saved his skin. So what an interesting anecdote. And now that's 2 lines in a book. What is that like if you're in there? What's that look like if you're present in that space? How does that change the dynamics? How do you make that? How do you gamify that? And so doing the research, falling down the rabbit hole side of things, one of the things I did was I spoke to a bunch of reenactors who do naval and maritime battles. And I learned some really cool things, which I want to have the play side of it, people to experience. If you're doing naval reenactment today, so presumably very similar to what people were doing back in the day because of the mechanics involved. First off, if you're dealing with a static fortified space, there's only so much cannon. And you don't have time to watch the muzzle flashes. There's no counter on your screen, so to speak. You listen to the rhythm of the guns, apparently. And so the speed and the rhythm that you hear with the boom, 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 that tells you how much shot your enemies have. And so that tempo is what people today, and presumably people back then, used to understand at what point is it safe to actually land an attack. Because you're trying to run them out of ammo. So you're sailing in, sailing out. You're trying to deceive them and use false actions to try and get them to use up all of their cannonballs, that's exactly what happened at Bunce, because we know that from the archive. So how do you then replicate that? How does that change our appreciation of history to be in that space and to realize your only signals are the sound? And you can immediately start thinking about ways you could gamify that.
Is your Bunce Island game, Is the intended audience going to be post-secondary university student or history students rather, or do you think there could be a place in high school?
So that's a great question. My intention is there's 4 ways to play the game. And I thought that was because I want a general audience to feel comfortable playing it as well, but I want it to be suitable and useful in a classroom setting. Um, so there's 4 ways to play the game, and on character creation, you select which way you want to play it. And that will determine how the game plays. If it's an educational format, then there's lots of data. And if you walk up to a cannon and you click on it, you're going to learn what the model of cannon is, who created it, all that stuff. If you are in the past and you go up to an individual that we have a record for, I'm also part of a digital humanities initiative, which is linking together the narratives and the freedom narratives of those who were enslaved and those who were enslavers to try and better understand what that past looked like. So one of the neat things about Unreal Engine is that it can access external sources. So if you want to click on somebody, that can actually launch a window within the game that allows you to have access to large searchable databases. So this can be a tremendous tool and a sort of a data visualization tool within a classroom setting. But I understand that people are going to get bored with that type of thing if that's not what drives them. So there's 3 other ways to play the game. One of it is with a focus on trade, to understand the economics of this, to understand the trade values of this. So for that, one of the things that this will unlock for the player is most of the mini games that are available will be games of chance that were appropriate to that time period. The ability to navigate around the space will be contingent on getting a ship, because it's a large riverine estuary. So you will largely be able to navigate the coastlines and to interact with communities along the coastlines. And as you unlock, because I've gone through a whole lot of QA and a whole lot of community testing to figure out what people want and what people don't want. So there's the trade game, where you'll learn a lot about how complex this stuff was. And at the same time, the other side of it is culture. And so that's very much leaning toward cultures that were largely obscured. And that's probably the hardest one to develop, and that's been taking the most time, because it's things like understanding what hair braiding for women means, what the patterns in textiles that are being woven means. So if you're seeking culture, your ability to navigate will involve taking the form of a bird, at which point you can fly up country a bit, and you can go to rural villages, and you can learn from people what drum patterns mean, what textile weaving means. And you can explore that. And there is a main story to all of this, but there's a whole lot of sort of side quests and mini quests. And the final one is warfare. And this has actually been one of the most interesting, and I will indulge me for a moment because it's so cool. Because this is where rabbit holes lead to really interesting things and grants and projects which have to be funded. They have to be funded. They're so good because they answer so many questions. When they speak to something beyond the classroom and beyond necessarily the general public. So if you want to have warfare, there's tons of raids. There were actually groups of people who were very resistant to the slave trade and fought back. We have stories, and that does tie into our main story. We have one story of a man who led forces to burn down slave factories. And he actually ended up captured by Captain Crackers. And so we have a story about him from the 1720s that we're using. But there was an unnamed woman with him who helped him try and produce a slave revolt. And so we're focusing on her story with collaboration from women in Sierra Leone who want this to be sort of representative of Sierra Leone womanhood. So there's some really cool stuff there. But from the warfare standpoint, if you're creating a video game, you need to have animation loops. So it's just, your general breathing loop, and you plug in animations to the characters and they do the thing. And if you click a button, you want a fighting loop. So they're going to swing. And that all very logical. So this produced a problem, though. If I'm going to see how these individuals fight, then I need to see African martial arts, don't I? Because Kung Fu, not appropriate. European sword styles, not appropriate. So this led down serious rabbit hole time and led to seriously understudied problems. So there is the Historical African Martial Arts Association, which is comprised of Dumont Stith and a bunch of other associated individuals throughout North America and Europe who are trying to reconstruct what did traditional African martial arts look like. This has been so understudied. There is literally one book from Nigeria which covers 7 African martial art styles on a continent that has 8,000 different sociolinguistic groups. So this was a problem for me because none of them have been digitized. We don't really know much about them, but obviously they have to be there. So a colleague of mine in Sierra Leone, the chancellor at Central University, Maxim Sese, and I were chatting, and of course I do fencing. He saw me post something on Facebook and commented about it. And I was rather blunt and said, you know what I'd really love it if you could find me some martial artists up country who somehow preserved their techniques and their traditions despite colonialism. Thinking completely like, I'd like a unicorn, please. And he's like, oh yeah, we have loads of those. And I was like, I'm sorry, wait, what? And so we actually have a planned project, which is intended to go up country, interview these martial artists with Canadian martial artists who understand fighting practice, who understand martial intent, record that with Sierra Leonean collaborators, digitize that using modern AI technologies, which allow us to capture and motion capture performers, turn those into animation sequences, ensure that Sierra Leoneans maintain creative control over those animation sequences, which then become curated, annotated with information, and made available to the African martial arts associations around the world, the diasporic martial artists who are desperately seeking connection with their severed pasts, but make it available to the entertainment and gaming industry. So we suddenly start seeing these things being preserved.
What a powerful example of experiences that equip students and people to think within complex interdisciplinary systems, which is a skill that we so desperately need to be cultivating in our learners and in humans today. I can totally see how this game or this approach to gamification can equip learners with this capacity to think within the complexity of their everyday lives. And so I think it's just so excellent. And I wish that there were more folks like you developing games that were easy to grab and use in classroom settings, right? I think a lot about, I'm always stuck inside my head as an elementary school teacher, and experiences like these would have been so valuable for students. And I can't even begin to grasp the amount of work that must go into developing these resources. I like to read a lot of historical books and I always think often about how much work the authors put into creating such an engaging narrative in the book, to describe a topic that some people might otherwise find dry if we were reading about it in textbooks. So, and I take that and times it by a million when I'm thinking about all of the work that you're doing, so that students have multiple opportunities to engage with the topics or the subject matter. I do have just a question about consultation. So when you're going into these communities and you're looking for support, what does that look like?
It's hard. It's really, really hard. And there's reasons for that, which go beyond what you might expect. It's hard just because Sierra Leone experienced a tremendously brutal civil war for 11 years. Its infrastructure suffered big hits. So Wi-Fi is not guaranteed. Power is not guaranteed. So this is a cultural context where games are really, like digital games, are really not well understood, particularly when you go up country. So every time I do consultation, I need to be bringing a laptop and to be able to demonstrate this is what we're doing. This is not a film we're making. This is an immersive, engaging environment. So there's an element of teaching that's required before we can even have the conversation about, are you comfortable with telling these stories? How would you like these stories told? There's a further serious complexity, and this goes to my other research. So Sierra Leone is one of a number of nations in the Upper Guinea coast that prior to colonization, they were decentralized societies. They didn't have a central king, leader, etc. They were essentially overseen by what we might call secret societies. And they are still overseen by those societies. So this leads to serious challenges for development and doing so respectfully and intelligently. So there are gendered societies in Sierra Leone, Poro and the Sade Society, if I'm using one language group. It's also called Bundo Society. Um, and the Poro Society is a men's society, and the Sande/Bundo Society is a women's society. So children are understood culturally as being born without gender, which is really interesting. I mean, again, there's so much interesting stuff we can learn from this. When children become gendered, they are initiated into one or the other societies. And you do find Poro women, despite it being a men's society. So this is some really interesting complexities here. Prior to colonization, those societies ruled all things. And what they really oversee is they control secrets, they oversee spirits, they guide spirits to protect humans and to permeate and to basically protect against bad spirits, but also to permeate and positively affect human society. They do not like to share those secrets. And I am very, very conscious of my approach has to be a deeply respectful one. When I did my work on the Human Leopard Society, which is a criminal society, I made it very clear that I am not an initiate of these societies, and that my work is entirely and very explicitly defined to be what is available in the archive and what is available publicly and what is available through colonial sources. I do not claim any present day secrets because that is something that's very heavily guarded. So for me to represent a pre-colonial perspective of Sierra Leone means that I have to work with the societies. Those were the forces that governed. And this gets really, really challenging because these are very protective societies and they're very gendered. So I can speak to the Women's Society, and I have spoken to members of the Women's Society, and I have contacts who are working to help elders in that society to understand that what we could choose to represent is as explicit or implicit as they determine. It's not for me to say what their stories are. It's for them to determine it, but also they have to understand what I'm capable of producing for them to accentuate and to emphasize the power of their historical past. I am female, so talking to the Poro Society is a big challenge. And so these are another layer that makes the development of this game very, very complex. Because there needs to be so much of a degree of respect. But if I'm going to produce this and I somehow don't put the societies in, then it's not a historical take on what that region looked like. And so it's guarding and it's protecting where people feel comfortable and where people are okay with sharing their stories, but also keeping in mind cultural appropriation concerns. Because the last thing we want is for a group of entitled kids from the global north declaring that they're Sande or they identify as Poro. No, you don't. You're not from Sierra Leone and you haven't been initiated. So I'm very aware of that needs to be, I have to do a good job representing it respectfully and with full collaboration, which is taking, I'm not kidding, this is taking years. And I would love to have the game out, but I have to be patient and do this in the process and do it correctly. So, and at the same time, be aware of the fact that there's going to be people who are going to misunderstand this stuff. So how it's represented, I have to bring my global north eyes to that and my informed gamer knowledge to that. Because the people, if I'm talking to an elder in an upcountry village that doesn't have power, explaining what I'm attempting to do is a bit of a challenge. And making sure that she understands I'm being respectful. If she says she doesn't want something represented, it's not going to be represented, period. Much as I might like to tell a story, if that's a nope, that's a nope. So the process of consultation, in short, is very, very complicated. And that's been a very slow part of the development process. And I get that. That's one of the reasons why I'm also working on developing a game set for the Canterbury Tales in the 14th century. So I'm doing a few games because I want the world to see, for the Canterbury Tales project, I want people to understand how diverse medieval Europe was. We have this notion that it's a very whitewashed place, and it really wasn't. It was a very diverse space, and I think that's an important thing for students, for the general public to learn with. And that's a much faster process because I don't have to worry about the consultation process. There is a little easier.
Well, we definitely eagerly await the release of these fantastic resources when the time is right.
Thank you.
So I think we have time for one more question. What advice would you give to teachers who are curious about integrating games or playful learning and don't know where to begin? Because I imagine that most of our listeners, although inspired by your stories, do not at this time have the comfort level or perhaps skill set to actually develop their own digital media games, although they may be eager consumers of yours, you know. But yeah, what advice would you give to teachers who would like to integrate a little bit of gamification into their teaching?
What I would do is I would talk to the students to start off with. What games are they playing? And it's interesting because a lot of it's going to be Roblox. Oh, I hate Roblox. It fills me with rage because it exploits children's creativity, and that makes me grumpy. So as long as it's not Roblox, anyway. But ask the students what they're playing, and if it's a game you don't like, cough Roblox, cough. Find out what the type of game is. What does it feel like? Is it a game about exploration? Is it a game about fighting? Is it a game about, like right now, the Roblox, again, 11-year-old child, what can I say? They're really into this garden grow thing right now. It's apparently one of the most popular games out there. So, okay, let's imagine that you're teaching a group of kids who are playing Roblox and they're really into garden grow stuff. So maybe start talking to them. How would you ask them? How would you turn the process of real world gardening into a game? Invite them to share and teach you. And take what they teach you and refine that, approach that slightly differently. Is this something, could we apply this to modern day growing stuff, gardening? What about maybe we should look at what are native plants versus imported plants? Could we make a food garden? Could we make a forest garden? Could we approach this using First Nations traditions and awareness of staple foods that actually help? So you could basically take something which they're already really excited by. It's a fad, great, and let them teach you how the gamification works and what about it is exciting them. And then turn that around to what you might be teaching anyway and think about, well, how do you collaborate with the students? Because now they're excited because you're speaking their language. I mean, I wouldn't speak their language too much because then you're going to end up as a skibbity rizzler. By the way, I've taken to calling myself the skibbity twizzler to my kid, and I have completely destroyed the brain rot language in my house as a result.
So good.
Being a Twizzler is that's the way. So that's what I would do is I would find out what they're playing and try to harness that because that's where their passion is. That's where their excitement is.
Thanks so much, Katrina. Before we head on to the last little segment, which is just our quick questions, our rapid fire soundbitey type questions, do you have anything else that you would like to share or communicate with us today?
Oh my God, there's so many things I could enthuse about. Do you have any directions toward that? Is it armored combat? Is it archery? Is it making turn shoes? Because I do that too.
I think that all of those could be subtitles for future episodes, perhaps.
More than happy.
Yes. Well, perhaps I'll just ask you this then. Quick question number one. I am eager to know, what is your favorite game to play outside of work? I know you have a few and you've mentioned some, but right now at this stage in your life, at this moment, what are you really into?
So what am I really into? There's 2 games that I typically play. There was a third that I finished, but I don't think it has great replayability. One of them is obviously Minecraft. I like building stuff. I like building houses. I get very into how pretty can I make it. I believe firmly in the why do something if you can't overdo it. I also like playing Stellaris, which is by Paradox Games, and it is a massive, massive strategy game with the most insane levels of detail. I've never actually finished a campaign in it. I get bored about halfway through and I start a new one. But I really love that first bit. So right now it's Stellaris and Minecraft.
Nice. Now, my second quick question, you've already answered. If you could design one dream classroom game, what would it be? And we've spent a fair bit of time discussing the Bunce Island game, which is amazing. But I suppose we could reframe that question. If you had unlimited funding and a fleet of eager grad students to work with you and just access anywhere in the future in your career, do you have another idea for a dream classroom game?
I do, and it's the Mabinogion. Because I think, okay, this isn't a quick answer, so you may have to edit it. I don't know. I really am passionate about understanding that humans are complex and diverse creatures. And I think it's really, really key to understand that humans in the past were complex and diverse creatures. There's a lot of simplification that happens in our cultural narratives right now around, oh, well, people were always just two genders, or they were always this and they were always that. And I think that's nonsense. As a historian, I know that's nonsense. So the Welsh mythological Mabinogion features gender bending, swap gendering. My goodness, it's a queer story. And I love that. And it's an early medieval mythology. And I think it's so important to say, well, no, humans have been playing with all kinds of things, gender, identity, all of these things, since we were humans. And creating games that allow us to very authentically and rooted in history go back and realize that humans have always been humaning. And I think that's super important to learn and to accept.
I love that. Humans have always been humaning. I just wrote that in the footnotes. Yeah.
Hey, maybe that could be the title for this episode. I'm going to write it down too. Humans have always been gamification. Humans have always been humaning.
It's what we do best, for good or for bad.
All right. Well, that's a great place to leave it. But I am going to ask this final quick question, which is just, could you please offer us 2 recommendations? And it could be anything. These could be 2 resources you like, 2 games you like, books, articles, TV shows, recipes.
Oh my gosh.
Very open.
Really open. Wow. Other than just exhorting everyone to get into chainmail and sorting and all that good stuff. Because I think everyone should do that. That's really fun to do. Experimental archaeology for the win. From a game standpoint, oh my goodness. So many good games.
You can throw out a few good games if you want. I mean, that's okay.
Undertale, if you haven't played it. Play it thoughtfully. Play it very thoughtfully. Have you guys played Undertale?
No.
Oh my God, play Undertale. There you go. There's my recommendation, because it's real morality. And my kiddo kind of got me into it. And I initially was like, oh, stupid retro. I was there when it was all pixelated. Why would I go back to pixelated land? Pshaw. And you know what? It is amazing. I laughed so hard I cried at one point in it, and I ugly cried at the end of it, because it was so powerful. It teaches you that pacifism is really, really hard, but absolutely worth it. Understanding others, even those who dislike you initially, is absolutely worth your time. Causing violence and doing harm to others for no gain except your own is ultimately punishing and not worth it, and you will not have a good time. And at the end of the day, what you do really matters, and how you care about people really matters. And that's a game that it was made by one guy. He was a second-year college student, and he created one of the most culturally relevant and important indie games of all time. It's insane.
Words to live by. Like, we could just have that clip of you describing the game without the game, and it would just be like words of wisdom.
It is. It's a game where it's, to speak very, not short, but to speak a little bit about it. If you take the time to not hurt others in the game and to learn about them, you get to have a cooking lesson from a badass fish lady who gets excited and burns her own house down. It's awesome. And it's also one of the most, like, as someone who, I definitely fit into what one of my very dear trans friends calls the alphabet brigade. I fit into that world. And so it is also a really beautiful world from a queer standpoint. Your main character is non-binary. And you end up getting a couple of people together. And the fact that they're the same gender is not the highlight of it. Like, it's not tokenistic. And I really, really appreciate that. It's a love story in parts. And it's beautiful and it's freaking awesome. And my favorite bit about that is that when you do get the two people together, one of them is very shy and ashamed because she's always liked anime and she's kind of a nerd and oh my gosh. And the other one, who's totally this jock, is like, oh my God, I love your passion for this. That's why I love you, is because you're passionate about your crazy ass nerd things. And I think that's just such a beautiful, validating way to look at things that we are often shown that we should be ashamed of. And to learn to celebrate people for all the things that they bring their passions to and not see it as, oh, you're a nerd, but rather, oh my God, I love how much you love this stuff. And those are great lessons. And I think it's a beautiful thing. Undertale, yes. Musically, there you go. I'm going to give you out of left of yes for tip. Listen to Devin Townsend. So Devin Townsend is a Canadian musician who is known as the Mad Wizard of Metal, but he's not really a metal artist. He's a prog, I don't even know what. It's optimism music. You may get a sense that I'm someone who really believes in optimism and trying to encourage people to believe in things and do the right stuff. It's actually written all over my armor in Latin. I composed all the Latin for my armor, and it's covered in my values, which have to do with inspiring others and just seeking joy and seeking to make the world a better place. Devin Townsend has songs that are about shining for others. When you can't shine for others, maybe, or when you can't shine for yourself, maybe shine for someone else and you'll be okay. That kind of idea of it's okay to have dark times and it's okay, but, help each other out, be kind. And I think that's something musically that we can always stand to learn from. And I think those are always life lessons that we can stand to explore and be made richer and better and kinder humans for it.
Beautiful. Thank you for that.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Katrina. This has been an absolute pleasure. And I hope our paths cross again very soon. We would like to acknowledge that this episode was recorded on Mississauga, Mississauga territory, treaty and traditional, at Trent University in Peterborough, Nogojoanong, Ontario, Canada. We are grateful to the First Nations of this territory for their teachings about and care for the land on which we teach and learn. The podcast was made possible by a Trent University Knowledge Mobilization Grant and is skillfully edited and produced by our friend James Bailey.